Good morning. Good morning. This is Barry Jones with SP History and continuing with our series on the deep state. And this episode, in conjunction with Chapter 16, the previous episode, are extremely important going forward because I introduced a character named Alan Dulles. And Alan Dulles, if you recall in Chapter 16, he was introduced to us in this discussion as the Swiss director of American intelligence during World War II. Prior to that, in the private sector, he served as a lawyer with his brother John Foster Dulles at Sullivan and Cromwell. And his job at Sullivan and Cromwell was to hide the ties of these deep state operators who were heavily invested in the financing of Hitler's rise to power in Germany. Of course, this would be scandalous for the American people to come to realize this, that their own people, their own country had financed Hitler's rise to power. And so it was and that was all accomplished through the uh, investment bank. And we talked about that in Prescott Bush. And the lawyers for Sullivan and Cromwell's job was to hide that, to immunize these corporate corporatists, these robber barons, these power elites, these deep state operators, these 50 or 60 guys who ran all the big companies, had all the money, were investing in post World War One Germany. And so that's the hat he wore in the private sector for Sullivan and Cromwell. And then when World War II broke out, he had to switch hats, become director of intelligence in Europe for the United States. But as we learned yesterday, he was switching back and forth between those hats constantly. And he betrayed his own country and his own commander in chief by instead of waiting 6 or 7 days for the unconditional surrender. He negotiated a private surrender with the Nazis in Italy. And as such, he was able to sneak out some of the more strategically important Nazis to be used later in the war against the Soviets, the Cold War, specifically with regards to intelligence. And so the stated objective of the United States and Britain at Casablanca, that was FDR and Churchill, was to demand full and unconditional surrender and also to hold all the war criminals uh, to hold trials at Nuremberg and bring them all to justice so that this never happened again. Behind FDR's back, Allen Dulles negotiated a secret surrender with these Nazis and then immunized them by sneaking them out through rat lines. We talked about several particular Wolf, Dolman, and of course Angleton, his subordinate, was involved in this as well. So what we see is a deep state operator who is, in order to protect the assets of his clients, still back home in his Sullivan and Cromwell clients, was directly uh, he was being insubordinate to his president, to the commander in chief, and helping these big investors remain anonymous. And you're going to learn today there was a real strategic aim to this objective. I mean, it was very specific. And that's why I'm continuing with this topic today. I think Alan Dulles is so important to understanding going forward how this deep state works, how the treason that they engage in works, and then how they immunize and cover themselves and cover everything up afterwards. And you find out that even a president of the stature of FDR has people in the shadows uh, doing things that are directly opposite his wishes, his orders, in fact. They're just completely disregarding his orders. So I wrote this paper when I was a graduate student, and it gets into the weeds a little bit about this topic. And I thought it was necessary to expand on what I said in yesterday's video. You can only say so much in a 45-minute video. So I want to read this paper to you and just sit back and listen, and maybe this will fill in some of the gaps. So it begins with the introduction. As the European theater of World War II was winding down, an Allied effort to hold Nazi war criminals and their collaborators accountable was also underway. The Nuremberg trials were supposed to serve two public purposes: punishment and deterrence. Punishment for crimes committed against humanity during World War II, and deterrence against crimes being committed against humanity in the future. However, not all war criminals were treated equally. Some high-value targets were secretly snuck out of Europe via a kind of underground railroad by American military, intelligence, and/or political officials before they could face justice. One American official, Office of Strategic Services, OSS, Swiss Station Chief Alan Dulles, who was sent to Bern by President Roosevelt to fulfill, quote, special duties, shruggingly justified this policy of selective justice, saying, quote, at least we are getting the kind of experience we need for the next war. The next war Dulles was referring to would be the Cold War, the icy standoff between the Americans and the Soviets, during which, quote, the world would be the future CIA director's espionage playground. Indeed, the cooperation, or lack thereof, between Western intelligence officials and Nazi war crimes prosecutors is still a sensitive topic. Quote, it is increasingly apparent that the selective nature of support war crimes prosecutors got from officials such as Alan Dulles is cause for study. One such example of positive assistance concerns the provision of a specific piece of evidence, the diaries of Ciano, Mussolini's foreign minister, obtained for the Allies by Dulles and used in the prosecution case against Ribbentrop at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. Those diaries ended up convicting Ribbentrop, resulting in his execution. Juxtaposed against the extreme measures Dulles took to spare other alleged war criminals from the tribunals, equal to and/or worse criminals than Ribbentrop, the outcomes at Nuremberg are perhaps less encouraging than previously thought. Stating the obvious, this secret policy compromised the Nuremberg trials, exempting some notorious war criminals from justice. It also gave Dulles et al. Extraordinary unilateral power to determine who faced justice and who did not. Americans, more wary of communists than fascists, covertly provided safe harbor for certain well-connected Nazis to tip the Cold War scales in their favor, while simultaneously prosecuting war criminals they deemed less useful to them in the, quote, next war. All right. FDR and Nuremberg. It was American President FDR's desire that Nazi war criminals be, quote, pursued after World War II to the uttermost ends of the earth in order that justice be done. In fact, he and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, quote, originally favored taking justice into their own hands and summarily shooting Hitler's top military, ministerial, and party ranks. Estimates about how many Nazi leaders would have been executed ranged from 50 to 100, with Churchill morbidly predicting, quote, that killing could be completed within 6 hours. Ironically, it was Joseph Stalin who insisted on trials, lecturing FDR and Churchill on the merits of due process, saying, quote, there must be no executions without trial. Otherwise, the world would say we were afraid to try them. Hence the origin of the International War Crimes Tribunal at Nuremberg. The State Department versus Herbert Pell. Not everyone agreed Nazi war criminals should be punished. United States State Department legends George Kennan and Cordell Hull opposed the concept of a tribunal, arguing that, quote, purging these leaders from German society would not only be greatly unpopular with the German people, it would also be hugely disruptive. We would not find any other class of people competent to assume the burdens of leading post-war Germany, and whether we like it or not, 9/10 of what is strong, able, and respected in Germany carried the taint of Nazism. FDR, aware that the State Department might try to sabotage his efforts, appointed trusted friend Herbert Pell as the United States representative at the War Crimes Commission in June 43. Like his former Harvard classmate, FDR, Pell was an aristocrat, having come from old New York money. Pell inherited a tobacco fortune derived from Primo, the Bronx and Westchester counties, real estate granted to his ancestors by the British Crown. Though an avowed capitalist, he was one of the few such individuals who supported FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression. On one occasion, he even made mention of this to the president, saying, quote, "I am almost the last capitalist who is willing to be saved by you." Pell's support at home earned him ambassadorships abroad in Portugal and later Hungary during the years immediately preceding World War II. It was during this period he became alarmed, observing firsthand the rise of fascism. Pell's experiences in Europe influenced his support of FDR and the president's efforts to bring World War II criminals to justice. In a letter to Secretary of State Hull, Pell wrote, quote, "Absent punishment, the German business elite who had profited from Hitler's rule, and even the rank and file Gestapo men would go home to their villages and brag about what they had gotten away with." Pell outlined his top priority to Hull, quote, excuse me, "to make clear to every last German in the world that war is not a profitable business." Clearly, the State Department knew Pell was going to be a problem. From the time of his appointment, the State Department used every trick it could think of to keep Pell as far away from the War Crimes Commission in Europe as possible, at first holding up his departure for months and later recalling him to the States for a, quote, "consultation." In the former instance, President Roosevelt intervened on his behalf with Hull, but in the latter instance, Roosevelt was unable to help due to his own failing health. On February 1st, 1945, the State Department fired Pell. There was an effort led by FDR's Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, in April 45 to have Pell reinstated. Morgenthau met with the president, briefing him on how the State Department seemed, quote, "hell-bent on appeasing the country's German enemies," and on how it had unceremoniously dismissed Pell, arguing that, quote, "it was time to break the State Department and replace the old guard with loyal New Dealers." According to Morgenthau, FDR agreed with him, quote, 100%. Unfortunately, FDR's his death on April 12th sealed Pell's fate. When asked later what the reasons were for his dismissal, Pell opined, quote, "One is anti-Semitism, which is, to a large extent, prevalent in the State Department." Pell believed financial interests were also involved, saying, quote, "We cannot forget that one of the big war factories in Germany was the Opel company, which was owned and financed by GM, General Motors. The biggest electric company in Germany was owned and financed by GE, General Electric, another American company. We have here very potent reasons why a large and important group in this country is trying to pipe down on the serious investigations of corporate America's collaborations with the Nazis." I think you can see why Pell was not a favored man in the State Department by these deep staters. Pretty clear. The OSS and Allen Dulles versus Robert Jackson. 1 month after FDR's death, Allen Dulles offered his assistance to Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, whom Roosevelt's successor, President Harry Truman, appointed, quote, "Chief U.S. War Crimes Prosecutor." Dulles offered to provide Jackson with German witnesses and enemy documents and even put some OSS agents on Jackson's staff. The naive Jackson, unwise to intelligence community evidence manipulation and personnel infiltration operations, initially thought these efforts by Dulles were a, quote, "godsend." Only later would he learn that, quote, he had fallen into an OSS trap. Jackson's first run-in with the OSS occurred when he tried to take over the cases against the, quote, "industrialists and bankers who had financed Hitler's regime." OSS Chief Bill Donovan and Dulles, both Wall Street lawyers, felt they should be over the economic case instead of Jackson. But both also had large Wall Street circles with strong ties to the same business figures who might end up as criminal defendants. Due to this obvious conflict of interest, Jackson informed Donovan and Dulles that, quote, they would not be involved in the prosecution of Hitler's financiers at Nuremberg. Like the State Department had realized earlier with Herbert Pell, the OSS now realized Robert Jackson was going to be a problem. For his part, Donovan began secretly negotiating with defendants Hermann Göring and Jalmar Schacht, chief architects of the economic policies of the Third Reich. Göring was over the mining, steel, and weapons industry in Germany and the occupied countries, while Schacht was Hitler's banker, charged with hiding Germany's assets and maintaining relationships throughout the war with New York, London, and Swiss banking circles. In exchange for their testimony against other defendants, Donovan offered Göring and Schacht leniency. Naturally, Jackson and his prosecutors were horrified when they found out. Meanwhile, Dulles was busy intervening on the behalf of several of Europe's most notorious war criminals, obvious candidates for Nuremberg, and helping them escape justice. Quote, Dulles helped some escape through rat lines to Spain, the Middle East, South America, and in some cases, even the United States. Some remained behind in post-war West Germany, serving in Dulles's rapidly growing intelligence apparatus aimed at the Soviets. Dulles later justified his and Donovan's efforts as important to post-war stability and Western security. Regarding the former, he said, quote, most men of the caliber required to run the new Germany suffer a political taint. We have already found out that you can't run railroads without taking in some Nazi party members. Regarding the latter, he warned, quote, the Russians are acting a little better than thugs. The promises at Yalta, to the contrary, probably 8 to 10 million people are already being enslaved. And that brings us to Operation Sunrise. In a secret location in Bern, Switzerland, Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief, and Karl Wolff, commander of the SS forces in Italy, negotiated the, quote, secret surrender of the Axis forces in northern Italy a mere 6 days on May 2, 1945, before the official German surrender on May 8, 1945. Though an agreement was reached, Wolff and Dulles had different agendas. Wolff wanted sanctuary and Dulles wanted glory. Why was a negotiated surrender so important when an unconditional surrender was less than 1 week away? Officially, and according to Dulles, quote, first, there was concern that the Germans would attempt mass executions and reprisals against the prisoners of war and the civilian population. Second, it was feared that the retreating forces would follow a scorched earth policy and destroy all the industrial and hydroelectric facilities critical to that region. And finally, it was feared that the German army would attempt a last-ditch resistance by consolidating and digging into the mountains of western Austria. But Dulles's hand-picked negotiating partner, Wolff, betrayed Dulles's real motives. Though Wolff had enough war crimes baggage to demand his presence at Nuremberg, he was also in a unique position to help Dulles personally and professionally. Throughout the war, Dulles, the Wall Street lawyer, had, quote, used his OSS command post in Switzerland to protect his New York law firm's business clients in Europe. Stopping the war before these clients' manufacturing and power plants in industrial northern Italy were destroyed was a priority for Dulles. Under the terms of Operation Sunrise, Wolff agreed not to blow up the region's many hydroelectric plants owned by Italian Superpower Corporation. Italian Superpower was owned by J.P. Morgan and represented by Sullivan and Cromwell, Dulles's New York law firm. In fact, when the war ended, James Russell Forgan, one of Italian Superpower's directors at the time of the secret surrender and a close Dulles friend, became the OSS boss in London. This is but one example of a Dulles-connected financial interest benefiting from the Dulles-directed Operation Sunrise and the secret surrender, which is stunning by itself. More stunning, however, is the purposeful indifference, a generous characterization to be sure, to justice Alan Dulles exercised with respect to a verified war criminal like Karl Wolff. SS General Karl Wolff. Karl Wolff, quote, was Alan Dulles's kind of Nazi. Dulles admired Wolff's gentlemanly comportment and found him, quote, extremely good looking. He struck Dulles as a man with the right sort of pedigree, the type of trustworthy fellow with whom he could do business. And business was good. Wolff was a, quote, financially savvy fixer, a man whom the Nazis relied on to get things done. Originally a banker before going into advertising, Wolff's life trajectory changed in the post-World War I economic crash when he decided to join Hitler's political movement. Ever the opportunist, Wolf later claimed his choice was more professional than ideological. Wolf exploited the seemingly endless array of opportunities available to a, quote, polished blonde warrior. With the business background of Wolf, he soon put that business acumen to work as Heinrich Himmler's business adjutant. Quote, Himmler was no businessman, and I took care of banking matters for him, Wolf acknowledged later. One of his special tasks was to provide corporate donors of the Reich with pools of slave labor from the Dachau and Sachsenhausen concentration camps. To spare them any unpleasantness, Wolf even, quote, shut down the camp's crematoria during the donors' visits to the camps. In addition to overseeing Heinrich Himmler's financial interests, Wolf was, quote, general of the Waffen SS and Supreme SS and police commander in northern Italy. As such, he was slated among the major defendants destined for Nuremberg. Wolf's status as a war criminal was never in doubt. Indeed, a, quote, German court would later find Wolf complicit in the murder of at least 300,000 Jews, including the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. But Wolf never appeared before the War Crimes Tribunal. In fact, quote, his willingness to surrender to Dulles earned him favorable treatment during the post-1945 series of Allied war crimes trials. His status soon was downgraded to that of a witness. The successful outcome of those surrender negotiations didn't just benefit Wolf. Quote, it also benefited Dulles' future career, a career that ended as director of the CIA. And in the end, three factors: strategic cooperation on the part of the accused, Dulles' personal commitment, and the political interests of the Western Allies facilitated a Nazi war criminal's evasion of prosecution. James Angleton's Ratlines. James Jesus Angleton was a rising star, not yet 30 years old, in American intelligence. Angleton had run OSS counterintelligence in Italy during the war, remaining afterwards to fight America's new enemy, the communists. Allen Dulles, whom Angleton considered a father figure, mentored young Angleton. Together, they conferred incessantly in Rome about the, quote, Red Challenge. Both believed, quote, fighting communism was a bigger priority than prosecuting fascist war criminals, hence the Ratlines. To illustrate how the Ratlines worked, let us consider the post-war journey of SS Colonel Eugene Dahlman, whom will be discussed in greater detail in the next section. Like many others involved in Operation Sunrise, Dahlman was destined for Nuremberg until U.S. intelligence officials intervened. Having first escaped a British-run POW camp in Rimini, Dahlman fled to Milan, where he presented himself, Milan actually, where he presented himself to a Catholic cardinal. The Vatican elite had collaborated with Mussolini's fascist regime during the war and was now helping Nazi war criminals like Dahlman avoid the embarrassing war crimes tribunal in Nuremberg. The cardinal hid Dahlman away in a church-run asylum. When Angleton finally found Dahlman, Angleton had been searching for the high-priority, valuable intelligence asset. He, quote, sent a big U.S. Army Buick with a chauffeur to pick him up and drive him to Rome, putting Dahlman up in a Via Archimede safe house operated by U.S. intelligence. Then he gave Dahlman a fake identity card, identifying him as an Italian employee of an American organization. This document afforded Dahlman the freedom to wander the streets of Rome without fear of being arrested. Dahlman passed his time in Rome visiting coffee houses, bars, jewelry shops, movie theaters, and various nighttime entertainment spots. One day, Dahlman arrived back at the safe house after one of his jaunts to the city to discover a few more Angleton, quote, recruits, whom he recognized from the glory days. Angleton was literally stuffing the safe house full of Nazi war criminals, while Italian authorities and Nuremberg prosecutors were searching for them. Eventually, Dahlman was, quote, transferred to a U.S. military prison in Frankfurt, after which he and a group of other former Nazi VIPs were safely ensconced in a cozy guest house in the countryside. This underground railroad network helped hundreds and possibly thousands of Nazi war criminals who helped facilitate Operation Sunrise escape justice. Many of them eventually made it to America and other friendly countries and started new lives. If they helped Allen Dulles and company, he helped them. SS Colonel Eugene Dahlman. During the Operation Sunrise negotiations, Eugene Dolman served as the principal intermediary for Karl Wolff and Allen Dulles. As such, Dolman joined Wolff high on the Dulles list of recruitment targets. And like Wolff, Dolman fit the profile: sophisticated, astute, well-groomed, and more importantly, armed with an impressive network of German and Italian contacts. Dolman had left Germany for Italy 2 decades before the war to study Renaissance history during his graduate studies. He was well educated, fluent in Italian and German, and charming. His hair was slicked back, his suits were Italian, and his tan year-round. He became so thoroughly Italian that he even changed his name from Eugene to Eugenio. Reich diplomats valued Dolman's mastery of Italy's culture and language and appreciated his relationship within the Italian aristocracy. As Germany and Italy became more closely linked, Dolman joined the SS using his binational skills to rise to become the liaison between Hitler and Mussolini. Whenever Hitler visited Italy or Mussolini trekked to Germany, it was always Dolman who was seen by the visiting dictator's side. Like Wolff, the Nazis' fixer of all things financial, Dolman was the Nazis' main fixer in Rome. Ironically, Dolman was also an arts-loving homosexual, the, quote, type of person the Nazis sent to the gas chambers. But because of distance, Dolman was, quote, able to attend gay and lesbian orgies in Venice, a city like America's Las Vegas that kept its secrets. Diplomats such as Dolman could not expect to escape justice after World War II. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop was convicted and executed at Nuremberg. Ambassador Franz von Papen was later convicted and sentenced to 8 years of hard labor by a West German denazification court. But the OSS thought Dolman might prove useful as a Cold War espionage asset on the post-World War II front lines of Italy and Germany. He had already proved useful in the Operation Sunrise negotiations. For these reasons, Angleton, acting at the behest of Allen Dulles, used the rat lines to smuggle him out of danger. Wolff and Dolman, the second act. According to 2 Swiss intermediaries involved in the Operation Sunrise negotiations, quote, Allen Dulles had offered Karl Wolff, one of the highest-ranking Nazi officials to survive the war, clearly outranking most of the Nuremberg defendants, immunity from prosecution and a role in post-war Germany. The former claim is supported by Kirsten von Lingen in her book, Allen Dulles, the OSS and Nazi War Criminals, The Dynamics of Selective Prosecution, in which she wrote that, quote, there was a clear yet unwritten understanding of immunity, and by Dulles's bearing of incriminating evidence against Wolff, including an OSS report blaming Wolff for the, quote, wholesale slaughter of populations, collective reprisals against Italian civilians, and the torture and murder of OSS agents in his Bolzano SS headquarters, Dulles blocked this report from reaching the Nuremberg prosecutors. In its place, he submitted his written recommendation to the Nuremberg legal team, portraying Wolff as a, quote, moderate and a gentleman, and advising against him being prosecuted for SS crimes. Furthermore, in March 48, Allen Dulles came to Karl Wolff's defense again, supplying a German denazification hearing with a, quote, glowing affidavit that was read aloud in the courtroom. This time, Dulles wrote of Wolff, quote, in my opinion, General Wolff's actions materially contributed to bringing about the end of the war in Italy. Dulles also made sure Wolff was not subject to an employment ban after the war, an assist that helped Wolff, quote, land a job as an advertising sales manager with a weekly magazine in Cologne. As Heinrich Himmler's former banker, Wolff's network of business contacts with the advertising departments of leading German companies was such that by 1953, his impressive, quote, sales commissions enabled him to purchase a lake house for his family in southern Bavaria. Ironically, that was the same year his old friend Allen Dulles became chief of the CIA. In the mid-50s, Wolff became politically active in Germany again, establishing the Reichswehrpflicht, a neo-fascist party, and organizing an association of former SS officers. Thanks to Dulles, the band was still alive and well. And thanks to Wolff, it was getting back together again. As for Eugene Dolman, money troubles and erratic behavior prevented him from being the post-war intelligence asset Allen Dulles had hoped. At one time, trading on his notorious past, Dolman was spying, quote, spying on ex-Nazi colleagues for the CIA, reporting to, quote, neo-Nazi groups about U.S. intelligence activities and working as a British spy, all to cash in on his past. He even tried blackmailing the CIA, threatening to write a tell-all book if his financial demands were not met. The CIA eventually determined Dolman was of little value, speculating he would, quote, sell himself to Moscow and become a double agent if the price was right. Dolman eventually did the smart thing and retired from the spy game. For his remaining 3 decades, the always entertaining storyteller wrote novels, appeared on European television, and dabbled in cinema, living out his days in a comfortable residential hotel in Munich. Conclusions. The OSS generally, and Allen Dulles specifically, carried out a secret policy near the end of World War II, referred to as the secret surrender. This policy was, on its face, supposed to provide the public benefits of preventing mass executions and reprisals against POWs and civilians by the Germans, protecting the industrial and hydroelectric facilities from scorched earth destruction by the Germans, and putting a stop to all further German resistance. However, there is ample evidence to suggest that Dulles was mostly interested in carrying out Operation Sunrise for the personal benefits he would receive for protecting his Sullivan and Cromwell business clients. Whatever his motives, by selectively exempting some and condemning other Nazi war criminals, Dulles et al. Compromised the Nuremberg trials, creating a two-tiered system of justice. By doing so, Dulles et al. Gave themselves extraordinary unilateral powers to determine who faced justice and who did not. Americans, more wary of communists after World War II than fascists, covertly provided safe harbor for strategically important members of the Third Reich to tip the Cold War scales in their favor, while simultaneously prosecuting war criminals they deemed less useful to them in the, quote, next war. What was gained as a result? According to historian Gar Alperovitz, quote, a mere 6 days. The fighting in Italy halted on May 2. The total collapse of the Reich was recorded on the evening of May 5, 7, and 8. What had been lost? The possibility of peace depended on trust and mutual confidence. Because the OSS had refused to let the Soviets in on the negotiations, leaving them feeling deceived and suspicious about America's plans for post-war Europe, that possibility had been damaged. The secret surrender reminds us that the Cold War cannot be understood simply as an American response to a Soviet challenge, but rather as the insidious interaction of mutual suspicions, blame for which must be shared by all. Other historians agree, faulting Dulles for his, quote, naivete. I can't say that word, naivety, in dealing with the German SS and for his apparent disregard for the Soviet interests. The Nazis had boldly predicted the destruction of the East-West alliance. Wolff himself articulated the prophecy. Quote, the others will begin to fight among themselves eventually, and then we'll be in the middle and can play one off against the other. The course of history speaks for itself. It does indeed. Dulles' secret interventions at the end of World War II corrupted the end of one war by compromising the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunals and contributed to the beginning of the next war by creating the climate of distrust that came to characterize the 46-year-long Cold War with the Soviets. So I thought it was necessary to read that just to expand on chapter 16 and show you who we're dealing with, because Dulles' name is going to be front and center, very prominent going forward, especially as we get into the 60s and what happens to President Kennedy. And so this sets the table, or at least establishes his background or the backstory to who he was and what he would become. And this is first and foremost a deep state actor who was charged with the responsibilities protecting those 60 Sullivan and Cromwell clients who had invested in Germany and in Adolf Hitler and financed his rise to power, and continued to do business with Germany while we fought them. aiding and abetting the enemy. If that's not treason, I don't know what is. Then, when ordered to accept only an unconditional surrender, Dulles, in order to protect again his clients and their interests in Italy specifically, negotiated a secret surrender and gave immunities to certain high-ranking Nazis whom he thought would provide value going forward in the new war that he was trying to stir up with the Soviets. Remember, these deep state clients of his have realized that continuous warfare is profitable. So after World War I, they realized the next time we have a war of this magnitude, or any magnitude of that for that matter, we need to transition from one seamlessly to the next, seamlessly to the next. In other words, we need a continuous war footing to continue to make all this money. And that's what he's wearing two hats. But ultimately, his Sullivan and Cromwell hat was took priority over anything he was doing for the American government. That's treason. So, and that's Alan Dulles in a nutshell. Okay, until next time, God bless. Thank you. Have a good day.